has confirmed it's launched an attack on Iran.
The world is on the brink of a major geopolitical shift. For years, tensions have been simmering between Iran, Israel, and the United States. But now, those tensions have erupted into open conflict. The recent attacks by Israel and the United States on Iran have escalated the situation to an unprecedented level. With military strikes that have rocked Iran's most important sites, the world is holding its breath, wondering, where will this lead? How did we get here? What does this mean for the future of the Middle East and the international community? This is not just another chapter in a long-standing rivalry. The strikes are part of a carefully coordinated military operation between Israel and the U.S., designed to neutralize what they describe as an imminent threat posed by Iran's nuclear ambitions and its influence across the region. But what the world didn't expect was how quickly this situation could spiral into something far larger than just a military operation. Iran, unsurprisingly, is fighting back, launching retaliatory strikes against Israeli cities and U.S. military bases in the region. And as both sides prepare for what's shaping up to be a full-scale war, the international community is divided, with some calling for de-escalation and others calling for a complete dismantling of Iran's military infrastructure. But this conflict is more than just about Iran's nuclear program. It's about the future of global stability. It's about the intricate alliances that have held together the delicate balance of power in the Middle East. Israel, a longtime adversary of Iran, has been on high alert for years, watching Iran's growing influence and military capabilities with increasing concern. The United States, with its complex relationship with both countries, is now deeply involved, not just in securing its interests, but in maintaining the fragile balance of power in the region. In this video, we'll dive into the heart of the crisis. What exactly happened on February 28, 2026, when Israel and the United States launched their first coordinated strikes on Iran? What were the targets, and why were they chosen? How did Iran respond? And what impact is this escalation having on the region and the rest of the world? Are we witnessing the start of a broader conflict that could reshape the Middle East, or is this just a tactical strike that will soon be forgotten? With the world watching closely, we're going to break down what's at stake and why this moment matters more than ever before. From the military operations that have already unfolded to the deep political ramifications, this crisis is shaping up to be a defining moment in modern history. How will global powers respond? And what comes next in this volatile conflict? Stay tuned to find out. The origins of the current crisis between Israel, the United States, and Iran are deeply rooted in a long and complicated history of political and military conflict. For decades, the relations between these nations have been fraught with mistrust, animosity, and covert operations. The tensions escalated significantly in the early 2000s, when Iran's nuclear ambitions began to surface more openly. What was once suspected to be a secretive effort to develop nuclear weapons became a major geopolitical flashpoint. Both Israel and the U.S. viewed Iran's nuclear program as a direct threat to regional stability, and more specifically, to their own national security. Over the years, various diplomatic initiatives were attempted to curb Iran's progress. The infamous 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was hailed as a breakthrough. However, as the years passed, it became clear that the deal was not as effective as originally hoped. In fact, reports surfaced in 2023 that Iran had made significant progress in its nuclear development, which had been concealed by a sophisticated network of operations. Iranian scientists, many believed to be in cooperation with underground groups in the region, managed to achieve a breakthrough in uranium enrichment, bringing the country closer to nuclear weapons capability. By 2025, this shift in Iran's capabilities prompted Israel to take drastic measures. With intelligence reports confirming that Iran could produce nuclear weapons within months, Israeli leaders began to push for a preemptive strike. The U.S. was deeply involved behind the scenes, providing intelligence and satellite imagery to support Israeli targets. At the same time, the U.S. was increasingly concerned about Iran's growing influence in the Middle East, including its involvement in Yemen, Syria, and its support for militant groups in Lebanon. The increasing reach of Iranian-backed forces in Iraq and Syria, as well as its burgeoning ties with Russia, were seen as evidence of Iran's ambitions to become the dominant power in the region. This growing influence began to stretch well beyond the Middle East, with Iranian-backed operatives rumored to be involved in destabilizing operations across Europe. In 2025, several reports from intelligence agencies suggested that Iran had been orchestrating cyber attacks on European infrastructure and financial systems, further deepening the sense of urgency among Western powers. By the start of 2026, a full-scale war appeared to be an unavoidable outcome. The tipping point came in late February, when the US and Israel finally concluded that the diplomatic route had failed. Israel's prime minister, along with the US president, made the decision to launch a coordinated airstrike on key Iranian military sites, including underground nuclear facilities. These sites had been hidden deep within mountain ranges, making them difficult to target. But Israel had spent years preparing. Using advanced technologies, including Israeli-made cyber weapons and stealth aircraft, the two nations launched a series of precise strikes. The operation, codenamed Eagle's Wing, aimed to cripple Iran's nuclear program once and for all. The US provided aerial support and intelligence, while Israel handled the primary strikes. However, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Iran's response was immediate and overwhelming. With its extensive network of proxy groups across the Middle East, Iran retaliated by launching ballistic missiles at key Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv and Haifa, as well as US military bases in Iraq and Bahrain. The Iranian government also activated sleeper cells in Europe, allegedly planning a series of coordinated attacks on Western targets. While the Iranian military's missile capabilities are known to be formidable, what followed surprised everyone. Reports emerged that Iran had deployed a new, more advanced missile system that was capable of evading missile defense systems previously thought to be impenetrable. This breakthrough weapon, known as the Shahab-9, was a development shrouded in secrecy until it was revealed in these strikes. The missile attacks left significant damage in their wake, but the real danger was the potential for the conflict to spread. As Iranian forces flexed their military muscle, nations around the world began to react. Russia expressed strong support for Iran, while China remained cautious, calling for a ceasefire, but hinting that any further escalation would force them to consider their own interests in the region. Meanwhile, the United Nations called for an emergency meeting, but it quickly became clear that the organization had little influence over the course of events. Iran's alliances with militias in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq grew stronger, making it difficult for Israel to engage in any meaningful counterattack without fearing a broader regional conflict. This rapid escalation has set the stage for a crisis that could stretch far beyond the Middle East. With each day that passes, the question becomes not only about how the conflict will unfold, but also about the broader consequences it will have for global security. Israel and the US now face a choice: either escalate further or find a way to de-escalate before the region erupts into a full-scale war. The lines between military operations and diplomatic strategies are now blurred beyond recognition. The stakes are higher than ever. On February 28, 2026, the world witnessed a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle for dominance in the Middle East. After years of escalating tensions and covert operations, Israel and the United States launched a series of coordinated military strikes on Iranian territory. This unprecedented operation, codenamed Operation Eagle's Claw, was the culmination of years of intelligence gathering, political maneuvering, and mounting fears over Iran's nuclear advancements. The strike was a precise, calculated move, designed not only to cripple Iran's nuclear program, but also to send a clear message to the Iranian regime that its nuclear ambitions would no longer be tolerated by the West. The operation began in the early hours of the morning, when Israeli fighter jets, equipped with cutting-edge stealth technology, launched a series of bombing raids on key military installations in Iran. The primary targets were Iran's underground nuclear facilities, located deep within the mountainous regions of Isfahan and Natanz. These facilities had been the focal point of international concern for over a decade, and Israel had been preparing for this moment for years. Using a combination of cyber warfare and advanced aerial capabilities, the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, were able to penetrate Iran's sophisticated air defense systems. With a flurry of explosions, key components of Iran's nuclear infrastructure were destroyed in mere minutes. The devastation was unprecedented, as entire sections of Iran's nuclear research and development sites were obliterated. While Israel took the lead in the strike, the United States played an equally critical role behind the scenes. American intelligence, gathered from a network of satellites and undercover operatives embedded within Iran, had been crucial in identifying the exact locations of the nuclear facilities and the most vulnerable points for a strike. The U.S. also provided logistical support, sending a fleet of bombers and fighter jets from U.S. bases in Bahrain and Qatar to provide aerial backup and ensure the operation's success. In total, over 100 targets were hit across Iran, with bombings occurring in rapid succession to minimize Iran's ability to respond. However, what many did not anticipate was the scale and scope of the subsequent retaliation from Iran. As Israel's airstrikes continued, Iranian forces immediately responded with a series of rocket attacks aimed at Israeli cities and American military installations in the region. The Iranian military launched dozens of ballistic missiles, targeting Tel Aviv, Haifa, and several U.S. bases in Iraq. These missile strikes were not only an act of revenge, but also a demonstration of Iran's growing military capabilities. In an unprecedented move, Iran unveiled a new missile system, the Shahab-12, which is believed to be far more advanced than anything previously seen in the region. This new missile system was capable of evading most missile defense systems, leaving Israel and the U.S. scrambling to defend against the incoming barrage. The Israeli Iron Dome, long considered one of the most advanced missile defense systems in the world, struggled to intercept the incoming threats, and several missiles successfully struck their targets. The scale of the attack took both Israel and the United States by surprise. While both nations had prepared for the possibility of retaliation, the sheer intensity of Iran's missile response marked a dramatic escalation in the conflict. Israeli officials reported several casualties in the missile strikes, and critical infrastructure in Tel Aviv was damaged. Similarly, U.S. military bases in Iraq were hit hard, with significant losses of equipment and personnel. The Pentagon quickly began deploying additional forces to the region, including aircraft carriers and missile defense systems, in an effort to contain the situation. However, it was clear that the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. As the missile strikes unfolded, it became apparent that Iran was not simply retaliating for the strikes on its nuclear facilities. Reports soon emerged that Iran had been preparing for this moment for months, with the regime anticipating a military response. Iranian officials, aware of Israel's military capabilities, had been stockpiling advanced missile technology and preparing their forces for a long-term confrontation. This preparation gave Iran the ability to launch an overwhelming and well-coordinated counteroffensive that sent shockwaves across the region. Despite the immediate losses, the international community remained divided in its response. While the United States and Israel maintained that the strikes were a necessary measure to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions and protect global security, other nations expressed concern over the long-term consequences of the escalation. Russia, a key ally of Iran, condemned the strikes and vowed to provide support to Tehran, further complicating the situation. China, on the other hand, called for an immediate ceasefire and warned that any further escalation would risk destabilizing the entire region. With the world watching, the events of February 28, 2026, set the stage for what could become the most significant military conflict in the Middle East in decades. The next moves would determine not only the fate of the region, but also the future of global diplomacy. In the days following the joint airstrike by Israel and the United States on Iran's military infrastructure, the situation rapidly spiraled into a full-blown regional conflict. While the strikes were initially hailed as a major success by the governments of both countries, the repercussions of the operation quickly became apparent. Within hours of the attack, Iranian forces, bolstered by militia groups and proxy organizations spread across the Middle East, initiated a devastating series of retaliatory actions aimed not only at Israel and the U.S., but also at regional allies and global powers they perceived as complicit. The damage was immediate, and it became clear that the conflict was not going to remain contained within the borders of Iran. The first and most obvious response came from Iranian missiles. Dozens of short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles were launched from various bases across Iran, targeting key Israeli cities. Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Eilat were struck, with the latter suffering a particularly devastating blow. The missiles carried payloads powerful enough to destroy critical infrastructure, including communications hubs, power plants, and military installations. While Israel's Iron Dome defense system intercepted several of the incoming threats, a handful of missiles broke through, causing widespread panic and destruction. Iranian authorities claimed that the attacks were only the beginning, and a state of emergency was declared in Israel, with air raid sirens blaring across the nation. Civilian casualties were reported, although they were relatively low considering the scope of the strike. Israeli officials, rattled but determined, vowed retaliation and began preparing a counterattack with air superiority as a central element. While Israel scrambled to assess the damage, the United States, already deeply involved in the conflict, found itself grappling with a different set of challenges. In the wake of the airstrikes, U.S. military bases across Iraq, Syria, and Bahrain came under attack. These bases, critical to American operations in the region, were heavily targeted by Iranian-backed militia forces, some of whom had long been entrenched in Iraq and Syria. A combination of missile attacks and drone strikes hit bases in Baghdad, Kirkuk, and Ramadi, resulting in severe damage to American military equipment, including air defense systems and fighter jets stationed in the region. The Pentagon was forced to send additional reinforcements, including special operations units, to protect key assets and secure the remaining bases. But the attacks on American installations didn't stop there. Iran, in an unexpected move, revealed its growing capability in cyber warfare. Reports from U.S. intelligence agencies suggested that Iran had infiltrated key sectors of the U.S. power grid, triggering a series of rolling blackouts across the eastern United States. While the damage was not catastrophic, it sent a clear message that Iran was willing to fight on multiple fronts. The conflict was no longer limited to missile strikes and military targets. As Iranian forces and their proxies attacked military sites, they also sought to destabilize the region's oil infrastructure, which was critical to both global and regional economies. In a calculated move, Iranian forces targeted oil pipelines stretching from Saudi Arabia to the Persian Gulf. The attacks, using advanced drone technology, crippled key pipelines that were vital to the region's oil exports. Saudi Arabia, already drawn into the conflict due to its alliance with the U.S., retaliated by launching airstrikes against suspected Iranian oil facilities in southern Iran. These moves escalated the conflict even further, with regional powers lining up on either side, and the price of oil skyrocketing as fears of a wider war began to take hold. In a highly controversial decision, the European Union called for an emergency summit to address the escalating violence, though no consensus was reached on how to proceed. France and Germany urged for a return to diplomatic talks, but nations like Poland, Finland, and Sweden voiced strong support for Israel and the United States. While the battlefield grew more intense, diplomatic efforts were still being attempted on the global stage. At the United Nations, an emergency session was called to address the escalating crisis. However, the divided nature of the Security Council became painfully obvious. The United States and Israel vetoed any attempt to issue a ceasefire, citing the need to maintain security in the face of what they described as an unprovoked attack. On the other hand, Russia and China, both of whom had their own vested interests in the region, opposed the military action, calling it an unjustifiable escalation. Russia's involvement with Iran was already well known, with Moscow providing both military and economic support to Tehran in recent years. During the UN session, Russia's ambassador threatened to send military aid to Iran if the US and Israel did not halt their strikes. This was seen as a serious warning, as Russia's military assets in the region were formidable. The United States, already stretched thin with its operations in the Middle East, found itself caught between maintaining its military commitments and dealing with the diplomatic fallout. Behind the scenes, there were also troubling reports of escalating militia activity in other parts of the world. In Lebanon, Hezbollah fighters, with backing from Iran, began engaging in asymmetric warfare against Israeli forces. The militia's attacks were mostly focused on border regions, but they began to infiltrate deeper into Israeli territory, launching hit-and-run assaults and using drones to target military convoys. Israel, already committed to the ongoing strikes on Iranian soil, was now faced with the prospect of a second front opening up to the north. The possibility of a two-front war was rapidly becoming a reality, and Israeli forces were forced to redirect significant resources to counter Hezbollah's advances. As the attacks on both military and civilian infrastructure mounted, the economic impact of the war became evident. The cost of oil surged to record highs, and fears of a global economic downturn gripped the financial markets. The rising energy prices sent shockwaves through international trade, with countries across Europe, Asia, and the Americas facing skyrocketing costs for fuel and goods. In the US, the economic strain was exacerbated by the cyber attacks on its infrastructure, which hampered the ability to conduct normal business operations. Stock markets in the US and Europe plunged as investors panicked about the growing uncertainty. The collapse of the global supply chain further deepened fears that this conflict could lead to a prolonged period of economic instability. Meanwhile, on the ground in Iran, there was growing unrest among the civilian population. Many Iranians, particularly those living in urban centers, found themselves caught in the crossfire. The strikes on Tehran, Isfahan, and other key cities caused widespread destruction, and the Iranian government's response was swift and brutal. Reports began to surface of government forces conducting raids on suspected anti-government protesters, detaining and executing individuals in an effort to maintain control over the situation. This led to an increase in international condemnation of Iran's human rights record. However, Tehran remained defiant, continuing to bolster its military efforts and claiming that the strikes were part of a larger global conspiracy to destabilize the nation. As the situation continued to worsen, it was unclear how far both sides were willing to escalate the conflict. Each military strike, each diplomatic move, only seemed to push the region closer to an all-out war. With alliances fraying and tensions building, the question remained, could this conflict be contained, or was this the beginning of something far larger? The answer, it seemed, would depend on the choices made in the coming weeks, as the world watched and waited. As the conflict between Israel, the United States, and Iran continues to escalate, the global community is left to grapple with the fallout of this unprecedented military confrontation. The consequences of the joint strikes on Iran have rippled far beyond the Middle East, affecting not only regional powers, but also global security and economic stability. The next steps are critical, as nations around the world must decide whether to step in diplomatically, support one side, or risk further escalation into a broader, more dangerous conflict. The first and most immediate consequence of the strikes is the dramatic destabilization of the Middle East. The fragile political landscape of the region, already riddled with rivalries, alliances, and proxy wars, is now teetering on the edge of full-scale warfare. The United States and Israel's targeted strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities have successfully crippled much of Iran's nuclear program, but they have also triggered an unprecedented retaliation. The Iranian government has shown that it is prepared to escalate the conflict by engaging in missile attacks, drone strikes, and the activation of proxy forces across the region. The strikes on Saudi Arabia's oil pipelines, aimed at cutting off global energy supplies, have had a devastating impact on the global economy, causing oil prices to soar to levels not seen in decades. This is not just an economic issue for the region, but for the entire world, with industries reliant on Middle Eastern oil feeling the pressure of soaring costs. The military escalation has also forced countries like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to take sides, exacerbating regional tensions and further complicating efforts for peace. However, the most alarming consequence of this conflict could be the potential for it to spill over into a wider, more destructive war. While Israel and the US have thus far focused their military efforts on Iran and its military infrastructure, the international community is concerned that the situation could spiral out of control. The involvement of Russia, who has long been an ally of Iran, further complicates the issue. Moscow has not only voiced its opposition to the airstrikes, but has also indicated it may send military support to Tehran if the strikes continue. This threat has led to growing fears that a proxy war between global superpowers could unfold, drawing in countries like China and even NATO allies who have vested interests in the stability of the region. The economic consequences are already being felt on a global scale. The energy crisis triggered by the conflict has resulted in an economic downturn across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. As oil prices skyrocket, transportation costs soar, and inflation impacts everything from food prices to manufacturing. Nations heavily reliant on Middle Eastern oil are facing the prospect of economic collapse if the conflict continues. The United States, despite its military dominance, is grappling with the economic costs of the war, with domestic industries suffering under the strain of rising energy prices and logistical bottlenecks. Global stock markets have plunged, and trade routes are increasingly under threat. The economic instability caused by the conflict is beginning to overshadow the military aspect, with international financial organizations warning of a potential global recession if the situation is not contained soon. On the diplomatic front, the crisis has exposed deep divisions within the international community. While the US and Israel have garnered support from several regional allies, including the Gulf states and parts of Europe, other global powers have been less enthusiastic. Russia and China, in particular, have voiced strong opposition to the military action and have warned of the long-term consequences for global stability. The United Nations, once seen as a beacon of hope for peacekeeping efforts, has proven to be ineffective in the face of such an aggressive and coordinated military campaign. With both sides digging in their heels, the prospect of diplomatic negotiations seems remote. However, the international community is still struggling to find a way to defuse the situation before it escalates further. Some nations have called for an immediate ceasefire and the reinitiation of diplomatic talks, but there is little optimism that either side is willing to compromise at this stage. As the conflict continues to unfold, the question remains: will this war remain confined to the Middle East, or will it escalate into a global conflict? For Israel and the United States, the aim has been to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat and restore a balance of power in the region. But as the retaliation grows fiercer, it's becoming clear that these goals may come at an immense cost. For Iran, the fight is not just about defending its nuclear program, but about asserting its sovereignty and regional power. The stakes are high, and both sides are poised for a prolonged and bitter confrontation. For the rest of the world, the fear is that this conflict could lead to a new kind of global war, one not defined by traditional battles, but by economic collapse, cyber warfare, and proxy conflicts that could draw in nations across the globe. If left unchecked, the situation could trigger a new arms race, with nations racing to bolster their own military capabilities in the face of an ever-growing threat. A conflict that was supposed to be about nuclear weapons has already spiraled into an economic and geopolitical nightmare, and the world is left wondering if it's too late to stop the tide of war. The next few months will be critical in determining whether this conflict can be contained or whether it will ignite a new and more dangerous chapter in global history.